The Cemetery Watcher. Old Willow Cemetery has long been a place of unease for the residents of the nearby town. The graves are ancient, the headstones weathered and cracked, their inscriptions barely legible. The cemetery is said to be watched over by a mysterious figure, a cemetery watcher who ensures that the dead rest undisturbed. But the townsfolk whisper that the watcher is not a protector, but a harbinger of doom for those who dare to disrespect the dead. Jack, a skeptic who scoffs at ghost stories, bets his friends that he can spend the night in Old Willow Cemetery without getting scared. Armed with a flashlight and a bottle of whiskey, he climbs over the cemetery gates at midnight, laughing off the warnings of his friends. The night is cold and still, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the cemetery in deep shadows. As Jack wanders through the rows of graves, he feels an odd sense of being watched. The wind whistles through the trees, and the leaves rustle like whispered secrets. He passes by a large, decrepit mausoleum and hears a faint scraping sound coming from within. Curious, he approaches the heavy stone door and tries to peer inside, but the darkness is impenetrable. He shrugs it off and continues his walk, but the feeling of being watched only grows stronger. The air seems to thicken, and the shadows around him deepen, as if something is lurking just out of sight. He hears a soft rustling behind him and whips around, but there's nothing there, only rows of silent, weathered graves. As he approaches the oldest part of the cemetery, Jack's flashlight begins to flicker. He curses under his breath and smacks it against his palm, trying to get it to work. The light sputters back to life, but in the brief moment of darkness, he glimpses a figure standing among the graves, a tall, shadowy form with glowing eyes, watching him intently. Jack's bravado begins to wane as the figure steps forward, its movements slow and deliberate. He calls out, thinking it might be one of his friends playing a prank, but there's no answer. The figure is draped in tattered black robes, its face hidden in shadow. As it approaches, the air grows colder, and Jack's breath comes out in visible puffs of mist. Panicking, Jack turns and runs, his footsteps echoing through the silent cemetery. The figure follows, its pace unnervingly slow, yet it always seems to be just behind him. Jack stumbles over a gravestone and falls to the ground, the flashlight slipping from his grasp and rolling into the darkness. Desperate, Jack crawls towards the cemetery gates, but as he reaches them, he finds the gate is locked tight, the iron bars cold and unyielding. He spins around to see the figure standing just a few feet away, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. The figure raises a skeletal hand and points towards a freshly dug grave nearby, its meaning clear. Jack's heart races as he realizes the grave has his name on it. The earth begins to shift and churn, the dirt piling up on either side as the grave opens wide. The figure steps aside, and Jack feels an invisible force pushing him towards the grave, his feet dragging against the ground as he struggles to resist. He screams for help, but the cemetery is silent, the town beyond it oblivious to his cries. The ground beneath him gives way, and he tumbles into the open grave, the dirt collapsing in around him. As the last of the soil covers his face, the figure steps back, its duty complete. The next morning, the cemetery gates are found unlocked, swinging gently in the breeze. Jack's friends search for him but find no trace, only the freshly filled grave with his name etched on the headstone. The cemetery watcher continues to patrol Old Willow Cemetery, ensuring that the dead remain undisturbed, and that those who challenge its authority are buried alongside them. The Bleeding Portrait. Nora had always been drawn to the mysteries of the supernatural, so when her family moved into the grand, decaying mansion at the edge of the village, she couldn't contain her excitement. The mansion was steeped in history and whispered secrets, but what intrigued her most was the legend of the Bleeding Portrait, a painting of a beautiful woman that was said to bleed every night at midnight. The portrait, hung in the main hall, was a source of fear and fascination for the villagers, who believed it was cursed, haunted by the spirit of a woman who had been murdered within the mansion's walls long ago. From the moment Nora saw the portrait, she felt a strange connection to it. The woman in the painting was stunning, with flowing dark hair and deep, sorrowful eyes that seemed to hold a world of pain. Yet, there was something else in those eyes, something that made Nora feel as if the woman were watching her, following her every move. The mansion was cold and drafty, its hallways filled with echoes and the scent of dust and decay, but it was the portrait that captivated Nora, drawing her back to the main hall again and again. Her family was less enthused. They avoided the hall at night, muttering about the coldness of the room and the uneasy feeling that crept over them whenever they passed by the portrait. But Nora was determined to uncover the truth. The rumors of the bleeding portrait had circulated for generations, and she was eager to see for herself if the legend was real. One night, unable to sleep, Nora decided that this would be the night she would find out. She wrapped herself in a thick blanket and tiptoed downstairs, careful not to wake her parents. The mansion was eerily silent, the only sound the creaking of the old wooden floors beneath her feet. She made her way to the main hall, her heart pounding in her chest as she approached the portrait. The woman in the painting seemed to stare directly at Nora, her sorrowful expression more pronounced in the dim light. Nora glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost midnight. She took a deep breath and settled herself in a chair opposite the portrait, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. As the clock struck midnight, the air in the room grew colder, and Nora felt a shiver run down her spine. She watched in stunned silence as a dark stain began to spread across the canvas, starting from the woman's eyes. Blood, thick and crimson, slowly trickled down her cheeks, pooling at the bottom of the frame. The sight was horrifying, yet Nora couldn't look away. She was both terrified and mesmerized by the sight before her. The mansion, already silent, seemed to hold its breath. Then, faintly at first, Nora heard the sound of soft sobbing. The sound echoed through the hall, filling the space with a sorrow so deep it was almost tangible. The shadows around her seemed to stretch and grow, creeping closer as if drawn to the bleeding portrait. The woman's expression shifted, her sorrow turning into something more pained, more desperate. Nora's heart raced as the temperature in the room dropped further, her breath coming out in visible puffs of air. Nora was about to flee, the primal instinct to run screaming at her to leave this place, when something even more impossible happened. The woman in the portrait moved. Her painted hand reached out from the canvas, her fingers curling as if grasping for something, grasping for Nora. The hand was no longer paint but flesh, cold and clammy, and it gripped Nora's wrist with an iron force. Nora screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere in the room. She tried to pull away, but the hand's grip only tightened, dragging her closer to the canvas. The world around her began to spin, the walls of the mansion blurring and fading into darkness. The last thing she saw was the woman's face, her eyes now filled with an unholy light, her mouth twisted into a grim smile. When Nora's parents awoke the next morning, they found the house as they had left it, except for one thing. In the main hall, the portrait still hung in its place, but the woman's expression had changed. Her once sorrowful eyes now burned with a vengeful fire, and her lips were curled into a cruel smile. But what struck them most was the new figure that had appeared in the background of the painting. Nora, her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror, was now a part of the portrait. Her features were unmistakable, but her eyes, once filled with life and curiosity, were now wide and vacant, forever trapped in the painted world she had dared to explore. The blood continued to drip from the woman's eyes, and the house remained as cold and silent as ever, its secrets hidden within its cursed walls. The villagers, hearing of the latest misfortune to befall the mansion, whispered among themselves but dared not approach. The legend of the bleeding portrait grew, a tale of caution for those who would meddle in the unknown. The mansion stood as it always had, grand and decaying, with the portrait hanging in the main hall, its new inhabitant doomed to an eternity of silent, unending horror. The bloodline. In the sleepy town of Cinderbrook, where everyone knew each other's name, there was an unspoken rule: the Thorne family was never to be crossed. The Thornes were old money, their wealth stretching back centuries, but it wasn't just their riches that kept the town in check, it was the fear. There were whispers, tales of dark rituals and strange occurrences, but no one dared to dig too deep. The thorns had a power that went beyond money, something that seeped into the very ground of Cinderbrook. Carla, a journalist from the city, didn't believe in such nonsense. She had been sent to Cinderbrook to investigate the family, to uncover the truth behind the rumors. She arrived with a sense of excitement, eager to expose what she thought was nothing more than a small-town legend. But as she began her investigation, she found that the town was more resistant than she expected. Doors were closed in her face, and the once friendly townspeople became cold and distant. Undeterred, Carla decided to visit Thorn Manor, the family's sprawling estate on the outskirts of town. The manor was a relic of a bygone era, its Gothic architecture towering over the surrounding landscape. As she approached, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The air was thick with tension, and the trees seemed to lean in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to grab her. She knocked on the massive front door, and after a moment, it creaked open. A manservant greeted her, his expression blank, his eyes dull. He led her through the darkened halls, the walls lined with portraits of the Thorn ancestors, their eyes following her as she passed. She was taken to a sitting room, where she met the matriarch of the family, Gabriella Thorn. Gabriella was an imposing woman, her features sharp, her eyes cold. She welcomed Carla with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, offering her tea and polite conversation. But there was an undercurrent of menace in her words, a warning that Carla should heed. The conversation turned to the history of the Thorns, and Gabriella spoke of their bloodline with reverence, hinting at secrets that had been passed down through generations. Carla pressed for more, her curiosity piqued, but Gabriella's demeanor changed. The smile faded, replaced by a look of disdain. She told Carla that some secrets were best left buried, that the Thorn bloodline was not to be trifled with. The conversation ended abruptly, and Carla was shown out of the manor, her questions unanswered. But Carla wasn't ready to give up. That night, she returned to Thorn Manor, determined to find the truth. She snuck in through a side entrance, making her way through the darkened halls. The manor was eerily silent, the air heavy with the scent of dust and decay. She reached the library, where she had noticed a peculiar painting earlier that day, a portrait of a man with eyes that seemed too alive, too knowing. As she approached the painting, she saw that it had changed. The man's eyes were now bloodshot, his expression one of rage. A chill ran down her spine, but she forced herself to look closer. Behind the painting, she found a hidden door, leading down into the depths of the manor. The stairs were steep, the air growing colder as she descended. The walls were damp, the stone slick under her fingers. She could hear a faint chanting echoing from below, a sound that filled her with dread. She reached the bottom and found herself in a massive underground chamber, lit by torches that cast long, flickering shadows. In the center of the chamber was a stone altar, surrounded by hooded figures. The chanting grew louder as they raised their hands to the ceiling, calling out to something ancient and powerful. Carla's breath caught in her throat as she saw what lay on the altar, a young woman, unconscious, her wrists bound by iron shackles. The figure in the center removed their hood, revealing Gabriella Thorn's face, her expression one of manic glee. Carla tried to back away, but her foot slipped on the damp stone, and she stumbled. The chanting stopped, and all eyes turned to her. Gabriella's smile widened as she gestured for the others to seize her. Carla was dragged to the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. She was forced to kneel beside the young woman, and as she looked into the girl's face, she realized with horror that it was her own. Gabriella Thorn began to speak, her voice echoing through the chamber, telling Carla that the Thorns had made a pact long ago, a pact that had kept their bloodline strong. The ritual required a sacrifice, a life taken to extend the life of the next generation. Carla had been chosen, her bloodline a perfect match to continue the Thorns' dark legacy. The hooded figures chanted louder, their voices rising in a crescendo of madness. Carla struggled, but the iron grip of her captors held her in place. Gabriella Thorn raised a dagger, its blade glinting in the torchlight, and as she brought it down, Carla screamed. But the dagger never struck. The young woman on the altar opened her eyes, a look of determination on her face. She raised her hands, breaking the iron shackles with a surge of unnatural strength. The chamber was flooded with light, and the hooded figures were thrown back as if by an invisible force. Gabriella Thorne's face twisted in shock as the young woman rose from the altar, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly power. The young woman turned to Carla, her voice calm and strong. She told her that the Thorns' pact had been broken, that their bloodline would end tonight. She raised her hand, and the chamber began to shake, the walls cracking as the ceiling caved in. The hooded figures screamed as they were crushed by falling stone, their bodies dissolving into ash. Carla watched in awe as the young woman walked towards Gabriella Thorne, who was now cowering in fear. The young woman placed her hand on Gabriella's chest, and the Thorne matriarch let out a final, blood-curdling scream as her body crumbled to dust. The chamber continued to collapse, but the young woman led Carla back up the stairs, through the hidden door, and out of the manor. The house was engulfed in flames as they walked away, the fire consuming everything in its path. The young woman disappeared into the night, leaving Carla standing alone in the field, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. Cinderbrook was never the same after that night. The Thorne family was gone, their manor reduced to ashes, and the town's dark secrets were buried with them. But Carla knew that the young woman's power still lingered, protecting the town from the darkness that had once consumed it. She returned to the city, her story untold, but the memory of that night would haunt her forever, a reminder of the horrors that lurk in the shadows. The Shadow Surgeon. In a state-of-the-art hospital, there is a section of the basement that has been sealed off for years. The hospital staff avoid talking about it, but the rumor among the nurses is that the basement was once used as an illegal surgical clinic, where a rogue doctor known as the Shadow Surgeon performed experiments on patients in the dead of night. Dr. Mia Price, a new surgeon at the hospital, is assigned to the night shift. She's heard the stories about the Shadow Surgeon, but she doesn't believe in ghosts. One night, after a particularly grueling surgery, Mia decides to explore the hospital's basement, curious about the old tales. As she descends into the basement, the lights flicker, and the air grows cold. The corridors are lined with rusted medical equipment, and the smell of antiseptic and old blood fills the air. Mia finds a set of old surgical tools, still stained with dried blood, and a series of patient records that date back decades. The records detail horrifying experiments, procedures that no sane doctor would ever attempt. As Mia explores deeper into the basement, she begins to hear the faint sound of surgical instruments clinking and muffled screams echoing through the walls. The shadows around her seem to move, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes. She finds a door at the end of the hall, marked with a red cross, and against her better judgment, she opens it. Inside, she finds a fully equipped operating room, eerily pristine despite the years of abandonment. The walls are lined with jars containing preserved organs, and the operating table is set up as if ready for surgery. The air is thick with the scent of formaldehyde, and Mia hears a voice, a low, gravelly whisper, telling her that the Shadow Surgeon never left. The lights in the room flicker and die, plunging Mia into darkness. She feels cold hands on her shoulders, pushing her towards the operating table. The voice grows louder, more insistent, as the instruments on the table begin to move on their own. Mia is paralyzed with fear as the shadow of the surgeon looms over her, scalpel in hand. The next morning, the hospital staff find the basement sealed once again, the door locked from the inside. Dr. Mia Price is reported missing, but no trace of her is ever found. However, the night shift nurses start to hear whispers and see fleeting shadows in the operating rooms. The legend of the Shadow Surgeon grows, and the basement remains a place of terror, where the line between the living and the dead is blurred by the sharp edge of a scalpel. The Silent Choir. In a small town with a deep religious history, there is an old church that stands abandoned. The church was once known for its grand choir, whose voices were said to be so beautiful they could move anyone to tears. But after a tragic event during a midnight mass, the church was closed, and the choir was never heard again. Maggie, a young woman who has recently moved to the town, is drawn to the old church. She's always been intrigued by the supernatural and loves visiting haunted places. One night, she decides to explore the church, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous silent choir. As she walks through the crumbling nave, she hears faint whispers echoing from the walls, like distant voices struggling to be heard. The atmosphere is thick with dust and the scent of old, decaying wood. Maggie approaches the choir loft, her heart pounding with anticipation. The air grows colder, and she hears the faint sound of singing, ethereal and haunting, as if the choir is still there, trapped between worlds. As Maggie steps into the choir loft, she's struck by the beauty of the voices, but something feels off. The singing is mesmerizing, pulling her deeper into a trance. Suddenly, the voices grow louder, more intense, and Maggie realizes that the choir isn't just singing, they're screaming. The ghostly figures of the choir members begin to materialize around her, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths open wide in eternal, silent screams. The church begins to shake, and the stained glass windows shatter, the fragments hanging in the air as if time itself has stopped. Maggie tries to run, but the floor beneath her cracks open, revealing a dark, bottomless pit filled with the tortured souls of the choir. The voices crescendo, begging for release, for someone to break the curse that binds them to the church. Maggie stumbles and falls into the pit, her body suspended in the void as the voices close in around her. The choir's leader, a ghostly figure in tattered robes, appears before her, his eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. He explains that the choir was cursed during the midnight mass after they unwittingly sang a hymn that invoked an ancient, malevolent spirit. The only way to free them is for someone to take their place. Desperate to escape, Maggie tries to plead for mercy, but the leader shakes his head, his expression filled with regret. The choir members reach out to her, their cold hands pulling her down into the darkness. As she vanishes into the void, the voices of the silent choir finally fall silent. The church is left in ruins, but the townspeople begin to notice a new voice among the whispers that echo from the walls, a voice that sounds eerily like Maggie's. The creeping fog. In the coastal village of Grimsby, the sea mist was more than just a weather phenomenon, it was a living entity, feared and revered by the townspeople. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, blanketing the village in a damp, impenetrable shroud. The villagers told stories of the creeping fog, how it swallowed people whole, dragging them into the cold, unforgiving sea, never to return. It was said that the fog was alive, a sentient force that sought out those who wandered too close to the cliffs, luring them to their doom. Lydia had always been fascinated by the sea and the mysterious fog that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. A girl of 16 with a love for adventure and a streak of stubbornness, Lydia often found herself drawn to the cliffs that overlooked the churning waters below. She would stand at the edge, watching the waves crash against the rocks, feeling the salt spray on her face, and listening to the distant, mournful call of the foghorn. Her parents had warned her countless times about the dangers of the fog, but Lydia had never believed the old stories. To her, they were just tales meant to scare children and keep them away from the cliffs. But the more she heard about the creeping fog, the more intrigued she became. What was it about the mist that filled the villagers with such dread? Why did they avoid it as if it were a living, breathing monster? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first tendrils of mist began to curl in from the sea, Lydia decided to find out for herself. She slipped out of her house and made her way to the cliffs, the fog already starting to thicken around her. The air was cold and damp, the mist wrapping around her like a wet blanket. The village behind her disappeared into the fog, leaving her alone on the narrow path that led to the edge of the cliffs. As she walked, Lydia noticed something strange. The fog seemed to be moving with a purpose, curling around her legs and pulling her towards the edge. The sea below roared with an unnatural fury, the waves crashing against the rocks with a sound that echoed through the mist. The fog grew thicker, denser, until Lydia could barely see a few feet in front of her. It was as if the world had been swallowed by the mist, leaving her in a cold, silent void. And then she heard it, a faint, melodic humming coming from the fog. The sound was soft at first, barely audible over the roar of the sea, but it grew louder, more insistent, as if calling out to her. Lydia's heart pounded in her chest, a strange mixture of fear and curiosity driving her forward. The humming seemed to wrap around her, pulling her deeper into the mist, guiding her steps as if by an unseen hand. Lydia followed the sound, her feet moving as if of their own accord, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The fog pressed in around her, cold tendrils wrapping around her arms and legs, pulling her closer to the edge of the cliff. The humming grew louder, more urgent, filling her ears with a haunting, otherworldly melody. And then she saw them, shadowy figures moving in the mist, their forms barely visible through the thick fog. They drifted towards her, their arms outstretched, beckoning her to join them. Their faces were twisted and inhuman, their eyes dark voids that reflected the endless depths of the sea. The fog pulled at her, dragging her closer to the edge, the figures in the mist growing clearer with each step. Lydia tried to resist, her heart pounding in her chest, but the fog was too strong. It wrapped around her, cold and relentless, pulling her towards the edge of the cliff. The figures in the mist were closer now, their faces twisted in grotesque smiles, their eyes empty and lifeless. Lydia's mind screamed at her to turn back, to run, but her body refused to obey. The edge of the cliff loomed before her, the sea churning and roaring below. The fog enveloped her, cold and suffocating, pulling her over the edge and into the void. The last thing Lydia saw was the twisted, inhuman faces of the figures in the mist, their eyes reflecting the darkness of the sea, before she plunged into the cold, unforgiving waters below. The next morning, the villagers found nothing but a trail of footprints leading to the edge of the cliff, disappearing into the mist. Lydia was gone, swallowed by the creeping fog that had claimed so many before her. The villagers whispered her name, their voices tinged with sorrow and fear, but they knew there was no hope of finding her. The fog had taken her, just as it had taken others before her, and it would take others again. The fog rolled back out to sea, its hunger sated for now, but always waiting, always watching, for the next soul to wander too close to the edge. The story of Lydia, the girl who defied the fog, became another cautionary tale, told to keep the children of the village away from the cliffs. But the fog, with its haunting melody and twisted shadows, remained, a living, breathing force that could never be tamed. The Cursed Carnival. Sam had always been the type of boy who craved adventure. In the sleepy village where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen, he yearned for something more, something beyond the mundane routine of daily life. So when the traveling carnival rolled into town one foggy evening, its garish lights flickering in the distance, Sam's curiosity got the better of him. The villagers were suspicious of the carnival, whispering among themselves that it was cursed, that those who entered never returned the same. But Sam dismissed their warnings as silly superstitions, too eager to experience the thrill of the unknown. That night, after his parents had gone to bed, Sam slipped out of the house and made his way towards the carnival. The fog was thick, clinging to the ground like a living thing, and the further he went, the more the village seemed to disappear behind him. The music from the carnival floated through the mist, eerie and distorted, and the laughter of the few people there had an edge to it that made Sam's skin prickle. But he pressed on, his excitement outweighing the growing unease in his gut. As Sam reached the carnival, he noticed that something was off. The lights, which should have been bright and inviting, flickered weakly, as though struggling to stay alive. The rides moved with an agonizing slowness, creaking and groaning as if they were ancient, worn down by time. The workers, dressed in faded costumes, watched him with hollow eyes, their smiles plastered on their pale faces but devoid of any warmth or joy. Despite the creeping sense of dread, Sam found himself drawn to a large tent at the center of the carnival, a sign above its entrance reading, "Enter if you dare." Without hesitation, Sam pushed aside the heavy canvas flap and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the music outside cut off abruptly, leaving him in an eerie silence. The inside of the tent was dimly lit, with only a few flickering candles casting long, wavering shadows across the room. In the center of the tent stood a circle of mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of Sam. As he moved closer, Sam realized that the reflections were not simply showing his current self, they were showing what he could have been, what he might have become if he had made different choices in life. One mirror showed him as a successful businessman, dressed in a sharp suit with a confident smile. Another showed him as a renowned artist, his hands stained with paint and his eyes alight with passion. But there were darker reflections, too, versions of himself twisted by anger, consumed by greed, or hollowed out by despair. Sam's heart raced as he turned from one mirror to the next, the images more vivid and real with each passing moment. Suddenly, the reflections began to move on their own, stepping out of the mirrors and surrounding him. They closed in, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light, their faces twisted into cruel smiles. Panicking, Sam backed away, only to find that the tent walls had vanished, leaving him trapped in a maze of mirrors and endless reflections. Everywhere he looked, his own face stared back at him, each expression more sinister than the last. The carnival workers appeared around him, their gaunt faces illuminated by the flickering candles, their smiles now predatory. "You must choose," one of the workers said, his voice low and cold. "Choose one of the reflections to replace you in the real world." Sam's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of twisted game? But the worker's eyes bore into him, and he knew he had no choice. His gaze flicked from one reflection to another, searching for the one that seemed the most normal, the least dangerous. Finally, he spotted it, a version of himself that looked just like him, no obvious distortions or twisted expressions. It was the closest thing to normal he could find. Taking a deep breath, Sam stepped towards the reflection, his hand outstretched. But as soon as his fingers brushed against the mirror's surface, the reflection's face twisted into a grotesque grin. The grin widened, stretching unnaturally across its face as it reached out and grabbed Sam's wrist, pulling him into the mirror with a force that knocked the wind out of him. The world around him spun and warped, colors bleeding together into a nightmarish blur. When the spinning stopped, Sam found himself in a twisted version of the carnival, where everything was wrong. The lights were dark and flickering, the rides creaked and groaned like the dying, and the workers' faces were now hideous, distorted masks of their former selves. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sounds of laughter had turned to wails of despair. Sam pounded on the mirror's surface, trying to break free, but it was like striking solid stone. On the other side, his reflection, now no longer just a reflection, stepped out into the real world, stretching and flexing its limbs as if it had just woken from a long sleep. It turned to look at Sam, its grin now a full, mocking sneer, before it walked away, leaving Sam trapped in the nightmarish carnival. The next morning, the villagers awoke to find the carnival gone, leaving behind no trace except for the eerie silence that lingered in the air. Sam's parents soon noticed that their son wasn't quite the same. He seemed colder, more distant, with a strange glint in his eye that they couldn't quite place. But by then, it was too late to do anything about it. The real Sam was lost forever in the cursed carnival, trapped in a twisted world where reality and nightmare were one and the same. And as the cursed carnival moved on to its next destination, it carried with it the echoes of the souls it had claimed, leaving only darkness and despair in its wake. The echoes of madness. In a modern, sleek apartment complex, where the walls are thin and the neighbors keep to themselves, there's a certain apartment that no one wants to live in. Apartment 1301 has a reputation: strange noises at odd hours, sudden drafts of cold air, and whispers that seem to come from the walls. The last few tenants all moved out within weeks, citing the same eerie feeling of being watched. Morgan, a young woman new to the city, is desperate for a place to live. She's heard the rumors about 1301, but the price is right, and she convinces herself that it's just an old building with quirks. She moves in, determined to make the best of it. The first few nights are uneventful, but soon she begins to notice the strange occurrences. At night, when everything should be quiet, she hears faint sounds, whispers, the creak of footsteps, the distant hum of voices as if a conversation is taking place in another room. The air grows cold without warning, and her breath fogs in front of her face. She brushes it off, trying to rationalize the events, but the feeling of being watched grows stronger with each passing day. One evening, as she's sitting on her couch, the lights flicker and go out. The apartment is plunged into darkness, and for a moment, there's only silence. Then, the whispers start again, louder this time, more distinct. Morgan can make out words, but they're twisted, warped, as if spoken through water. She grabs her phone and turns on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. She follows the whispers, her heart pounding, until she reaches the wall in the hallway. The sound is coming from inside the wall, a muffled conversation that sends shivers down her spine. She presses her ear to the cold plaster, trying to make out the words, and suddenly the voices stop. Before she can react, the wall cracks, a hairline fracture that spreads quickly, and from within, something presses against it, something that shouldn't be there. The plaster gives way, crumbling to the floor, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. Morgan's flashlight flickers, and she catches a glimpse of something moving inside, a shadow that shouldn't exist. A hand reaches out, pale and skeletal, its fingers curling around the edge of the broken wall. Morgan stumbles back, her heart racing, as the figure emerges, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin, its face a mask of madness. The whispers start again, but now they're coming from the figure, its lips moving soundlessly, the words echoing in Morgan's mind. She realizes with a jolt of terror that the figure is the last tenant, driven mad by whatever malevolent force inhabits the apartment. The figure's grin widens, and it lunges at her, moving with unnatural speed, its bony fingers reaching for her throat. Morgan screams and scrambles back, but the figure is relentless. She's cornered in the hallway, the flashlight flickering as the figure's cold hand closes around her neck. The whispers in her head grow louder, more insistent, filling her mind with chaos and madness. In a final act of desperation, she swings the flashlight, the beam catching the figure in the eyes. It recoils, hissing, and for a brief moment, the whispers stop. Morgan takes the chance and bolts for the door, but the apartment seems to twist and warp around her, the walls closing in as if trying to trap her inside. She reaches the door, her fingers fumbling with the lock, but just as she pulls it open, the figure grabs her from behind. The whispers flood back into her mind, louder than ever, and she's pulled into the darkness, her screams echoing through the empty apartment. The next morning, the building's superintendent finds the door to 1301 ajar. Inside, the apartment is empty, the air cold and still. The walls are unmarked, and there's no sign of Morgan. The superintendent sighs and makes a note to find another tenant, but deep down, he knows it won't be long before the apartment is empty again. The whispers will find a new victim, and the cycle of madness will continue. The Haunting of Meadowbrook Drive. In the heart of suburbia, where every house looks almost the same, there is one house on Meadowbrook Drive that everyone avoids. The Peterson house has been abandoned for years, ever since the family that lived there was found dead under mysterious circumstances. The case was never solved, and the house was left to rot, becoming a blight on the otherwise pristine neighborhood. The locals whisper about the house, claiming it's haunted, that the spirits of the Peterson family still linger, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. Jason, a true crime podcaster, hears about the house and decides to investigate for his latest episode. He's made a name for himself debunking ghost stories and uncovering the real, often tragic, reasons behind them. But this time, he's determined to prove that the Peterson house is nothing more than an abandoned building with a dark past. Jason arrives at Meadowbrook Drive late in the afternoon, just as the sun is beginning to set. The house looks worse in person, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling, and the lawn overgrown with weeds. The neighbors watch him from behind their curtains, but no one dares to approach him. He sets up his recording equipment and begins his investigation, documenting every step as he explores the house. Inside, the house is dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic, like old blood. Jason brushes it off, attributing it to the decay and age of the house. He walks through the rooms, narrating his observations for the podcast, but as he moves deeper into the house, he starts to feel uneasy. There's something off about the place, something he can't quite put his finger on. The rooms feel too quiet, the shadows too deep. He hears faint noises, scratching, whispering, but every time he stops to listen, they disappear. He pushes on, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. As night falls, Jason reaches the basement door. It's the only part of the house he hasn't explored, and he can't shake the feeling that something important is down there. He opens the door, and the smell of decay hits him like a physical force. He hesitates, but his curiosity drives him forward. The basement is pitch black, and his flashlight barely cuts through the darkness. The walls are damp, the floor covered in a thin layer of water that splashes under his boots. As he moves further into the basement, the air grows colder, and the whispers return, louder this time, more insistent. Jason's flashlight flickers, and in the brief moments of darkness, he sees figures moving at the edges of the light, shadows that shouldn't be there. His heart races as he realizes that the house isn't empty. The Petersons are still here, their spirits trapped in the basement, reliving their final moments over and over. The whispers grow into screams, and Jason feels a presence behind him, cold fingers brushing the back of his neck. He spins around, his flashlight illuminating the ghostly figure of Mrs. Peterson, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a scream of terror. Behind her, the rest of the family stands, their bodies broken and bloody, their eyes fixed on him. Jason tries to run, but the basement door slams shut, trapping him inside. The spirits close in, their whispers turning into a cacophony of voices, accusing him, blaming him for their deaths. The air grows colder, and Jason feels his breath leave him, his body freezing as the spirits draw closer. In his last moments, Jason realizes that the Petersons aren't just trapped, they're angry, vengeful, and they've been waiting for someone like him to come along. He was so focused on solving the mystery that he didn't see the danger until it was too late. The next morning, the neighbors notice that Jason's car is still parked in front of the house, but there's no sign of him. The police are called, but when they search the house, they find nothing, no equipment, no notes, no sign that Jason was ever there. The basement door is locked, and no one dares to open it. Jason's podcast remains unfinished, his fate a mystery. The house on Meadowbrook Drive remains empty, its windows dark and silent. But at night, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of a man's voice, desperately narrating a story that no one will ever hear. The Headless Horseman. In the village of Black Hollow, nestled deep within a valley surrounded by dark, ancient woods, the people lived in constant fear of the Headless Horseman. The legend had been passed down through generations, each telling more terrifying than the last. On foggy nights, when the mist rolled in thick and heavy, it was said that the ghostly rider would appear, searching for his lost head. The horseman was a figure of nightmare, a headless specter astride a massive black horse, his tattered cloak billowing behind him as he hunted for a replacement head, cutting down anyone who crossed his path. William, a boy of 15 with a taste for adventure and a stubborn disbelief in old superstitions, had heard the story many times before. The villagers would gather around the hearth, their faces lit by the flickering flames, and speak in hushed tones of those who had disappeared into the woods, never to return. But William was not like the other villagers. He scoffed at their fear, dismissing the legend as nothing more than a tale to scare children. He was determined to prove that the Headless Horseman was just a myth, a figment of their imagination. One particularly foggy night, when the air was thick with mist and the moon was hidden behind a veil of clouds, William decided to venture into the woods. He was certain that the villagers were wrong, that there was nothing out there but trees and shadows. Ignoring the warnings of his mother and the pleas of his friends, he set out with only a lantern to light his way, determined to explore the forest and uncover the truth. As William walked, the sounds of the village faded into the distance, replaced by the eerie silence of the forest. The trees towered above him, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching out like skeletal fingers in the gloom. The fog curled around his feet, swirling in thick, heavy tendrils that seemed to pull him deeper into the woods. Despite his initial confidence, a sense of unease began to creep over him. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The deeper William ventured, the more the fog thickened, until it became almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. He could no longer tell which direction he was going. The trees all looked the same, their twisted forms looming out of the mist like specters. Just as he was beginning to consider turning back, he heard it, the distant sound of hooves pounding against the earth. William froze, his heart racing in his chest. The sound grew louder, the ground beneath his feet vibrating with each heavy thud. He strained his eyes, peering into the fog, and then he saw it, a dark figure on horseback, emerging from the mist like a wraith. The Headless Horseman. The rider was just as the legends had described, tall and imposing, his headless body draped in a tattered cloak that billowed out behind him like the wings of a giant bat. The horse he rode was a massive beast, its coat as black as night, with eyes that glowed a deep, malevolent red. The horseman's sword, long and gleaming, was held high in one hand, ready to strike. Panic surged through William as the horseman charged towards him, the sound of hooves growing deafening. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the forest floor as he fled through the fog. The branches of the trees clawed at him, tearing at his clothes and skin, but he didn't dare slow down. He could feel the horseman closing in, the chill of death in the air as the ghostly rider bore down on him. Just as the horseman's sword sliced through the air, William tripped over a gnarled root and fell to the ground, the blade missing him by mere inches. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest, but as he looked around, he realized something terrifying: the horseman was not chasing him. Instead, the spectral rider was leading him deeper into the woods, steering him towards something he had not noticed before, an ancient, overgrown grave. The grave was marked by a crumbling headstone, covered in moss and nearly obscured by the encroaching roots of the forest. The horseman dismounted from his horse, the movement eerie and silent. With a bony hand, he pointed to the grave, the gesture slow and deliberate. William stared in horror, understanding dawning too late. The legend had not warned of this. The horseman was not searching for a replacement head, he was searching for a successor. The ground beneath William's feet began to shift, the earth opening up with a deep, guttural rumble. The fog thickened, wrapping around him like a shroud as the grave yawned open, revealing the dark, cold void below. The horseman stood motionless, watching as William was slowly dragged towards the open grave. He tried to fight, to scramble away, but the pull of the earth was too strong. As he was swallowed by the ground, the last thing William saw was the horseman mounting his steed once more, the red glow of the horse's eyes piercing the fog. The horseman rode away, disappearing into the mist, his curse passed on to a new victim. The earth closed over William, and the woods fell silent once more. The next morning, the villagers found William's hat at the edge of the woods, lying abandoned in the dirt. There was no sign of the boy, no trace of where he had gone. But as they stood at the edge of the forest, they heard it, the faint, distant sound of hooves echoing through the trees, growing fainter as it faded into the depths of the woods. And they knew, with a deep, chilling certainty, that the Headless Horseman had found his successor. The well. In the heart of a small, isolated village stood an ancient well, its stone walls worn smooth by centuries of use. The well was the village's lifeblood, providing water for drinking, cooking, and washing. But it was more than just a source of water, it was the center of a dark legend that the villagers spoke of only in hushed tones, a tale passed down through generations. The legend told of a creature that lived at the bottom of the well, a monstrous being that fed on the souls of those who dared to draw water after dark. The villagers took the legend seriously, for there had been disappearances over the years, people who had ventured to the well after sunset and were never seen again. The well was always sealed at dusk, its heavy wooden lid firmly in place, and no one was allowed to approach it until the sun rose again. But as with all legends, there were those who didn't believe, who dismissed the stories as nothing more than old superstitions. Jacob was one of those people. A stubborn, headstrong boy of 15, he scoffed at the idea of a creature living in the well. He had drawn water from it countless times, and nothing had ever happened. To him, the warnings were nothing but the ramblings of old men and women, clinging to the past. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the village settled into the quiet of night, Jacob's mother asked him to fetch water from the well. She had been busy all day, and there was no water left for the evening meal. Jacob hesitated for a moment, glancing out the window at the gathering darkness, but then he shrugged off his unease. The well was just a well, and he wasn't afraid of some made-up creature. Grabbing the empty jug, Jacob headed out into the cool evening air. The village was silent, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind through the trees. The sky was a deep purple, the last rays of sunlight fading as stars began to twinkle overhead. The well stood at the center of the village, its old stones glowing faintly in the dim light. As Jacob approached, he felt a slight chill, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. He set the jug down beside the well and lifted the heavy wooden lid, grunting with the effort. The air inside the well was cool and damp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of wet stone. Jacob tied the bucket to the rope and lowered it into the well, listening to the creak of the rope as it descended into the darkness. The bucket hit the water with a soft splash, and Jacob began to crank it back up, his thoughts wandering as he worked. But as the bucket neared the top, he heard something, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. A low, gurgling sound, like the bubbling of water deep below. Jacob paused, frowning, but then he shook his head. It was probably just the water echoing off the walls of the well. He pulled the bucket up the rest of the way and filled his jug, but as he leaned over to close the lid, he caught a glimpse of movement in the darkness below. His heart skipped a beat, and he leaned closer, peering down into the well. The water was calm, reflecting the stars overhead, but as he watched, ripples began to spread across its surface. Something was moving down there, something large and slow, rising up from the depths. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the creature emerged from the water. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, a grotesque, slimy mass of twisted flesh and sinew, its body glistening with moisture. Long, sinewy arms reached out from its sides, ending in clawed, webbed fingers. Its face was a nightmare, its eyes glowing with a sickly green light, its mouth a gaping maw filled with sharp, jagged teeth. The creature stared up at Jacob, its eyes locked onto his, and it spoke in a voice that sounded like the bubbling of water, deep and resonant. "I have been waiting for you," it whispered, its words sending a chill down Jacob's spine. "I am hungry, and you must feed me." Terror gripped Jacob as the creature's long arms shot out, wrapping around his legs and pulling him closer to the edge. He struggled, kicking and clawing at the stones, but the creature's grip was too strong. It dragged him towards the dark, gaping maw of the well, its cold, wet body wrapping around him like a snake. Jacob tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the gurgling roar of the creature as it pulled him down into the well. The darkness swallowed him whole, the cold water closing over his head as the creature dragged him deeper and deeper into the abyss. The last thing Jacob heard was the echo of his own screams, bouncing off the stone walls, before everything went silent. The villagers heard the screams too, echoing through the night, and they rushed to the well, torches in hand. But when they arrived, it was too late. The water in the well had turned a deep, crimson red, and the wooden bucket floated on the surface, empty. The creature was gone, vanished back into the depths, leaving no trace of Jacob behind. In the days that followed, the village elders decided to seal the well for good, covering it with heavy stones and warning the villagers to never speak of it again. But the legend of the creature lived on, whispered among the children who dared to pass by the well at night. They said the creature still lived at the bottom of the well, waiting for the next soul to draw water after dark. And in the dead of night, if you stood close enough, you could still hear the faint gurgling sound coming from deep below, the sound of the creature stirring, hungry and waiting for its next victim. The Harvest Man. In the heart of a sprawling countryside, where fields of golden wheat stretch endlessly toward the horizon, there lies a small village with a haunting tradition. Each year, as the harvest season approaches, the villagers whisper about the Harvest Man, a scarecrow-like figure said to come to life when the moon is full and the crops are ripe. The Harvest Man is believed to be the guardian of the fields, ensuring that the crops flourish and the village thrives. But with his protection comes a dark price. It is said that the Harvest Man demands a sacrifice to guarantee a bountiful harvest, a life to be taken and buried in the soil. Riley, a strong-willed and practical girl, had grown up hearing the tales of the Harvest Man. Like most of the village's youth, she dismissed the stories as nothing more than superstitions meant to scare children into obedience. Her family, like many others, relied on the fields for their livelihood, and as the harvest season neared, Riley found herself working late into the evenings, her hands calloused from hours spent pulling weeds and harvesting crops. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Riley lingered in the fields, lost in her thoughts. The air was cool and crisp, the first hint of autumn in the breeze. As she worked, she noticed a strange movement out of the corner of her eye, a tall, shadowy figure standing at the far edge of the field. Squinting against the dim light, Riley saw what appeared to be a scarecrow, its ragged clothing fluttering in the wind, its head a burlap sack with crude features stitched onto its surface. At first, Riley thought nothing of it, just another scarecrow placed to deter the birds. But as she continued to work, she couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was watching her. Every time she glanced up, the scarecrow seemed to have shifted slightly, its head tilted in her direction, as if observing her every move. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but she shook it off, telling herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. As night fell, the fields grew eerily quiet. The sounds of the day, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, were replaced by an unsettling stillness. Riley was about to call it a night and head home when she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like the sound of something sharp striking the earth. She paused, her heart pounding in her chest, straining to hear more. The tapping grew louder, closer, accompanied by the rustle of something moving through the crops. Glancing up, Riley's breath caught in her throat. The scarecrow, the Harvest Man, was no longer at the edge of the field. It was much closer now, its tall, spindly form illuminated by the pale light of the moon. The figure was more defined, its body seemingly made of twisted vines and hay, with long, skeletal arms that dangled at its sides. Its burlap head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and from within the stitched eyes glowed an eerie, unnatural light. Panic surged through Riley as the Harvest Man began to move, its long limbs carrying it toward her with slow, deliberate steps. She turned and ran, the tall stalks of wheat whipping against her legs as she fled. But the Harvest Man was relentless, its strides unnaturally long, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. Riley's heart pounded in her ears, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she raced toward the village. But just as she thought she might escape, she felt something cold and rough coil around her ankle. The Harvest Man's arm, if it could even be called that, had stretched out, vines twisting around her leg like a snake. Riley screamed, thrashing and kicking in a desperate attempt to free herself, but the Harvest Man's grip was unyielding. It dragged her backward, pulling her toward the edge of the field, where the earth had been freshly turned, a gaping pit waiting for its next occupant. As Riley struggled, the Harvest Man leaned over her, its grotesque face hovering inches from hers. When it spoke, its voice was a low, raspy whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves in the wind. A sacrifice must be made, it intoned, its breath cold against her skin. The fields demand it. The earth must be fed. Riley's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of terror and disbelief. She clawed at the ground, trying to find purchase, but the Harvest Man's strength was overwhelming. With a final, desperate cry, she tried to plead with the figure, to reason with it, but her words were swallowed by the darkness. The Harvest Man's eyes glowed brighter as it dragged her into the pit, its bony hands shoveling earth over her struggling form. The soil was cold and heavy, pressing down on her, filling her mouth and nose, cutting off her air. The last thing Riley saw before the darkness claimed her was the harvest man standing tall above her, its burlap sack head turned towards the village, as if marking its next victim. The next morning, the villagers awoke to find the fields lush and full, the crops more abundant than ever before. But Riley was nowhere to be found. Her family searched the fields, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. In the center of the field, the harvest man stood, its form as still and silent as it had always been, its head tilted slightly as if in silent vigil. The villagers knew what had happened, though none dared to speak it aloud. The harvest man had claimed its sacrifice, and the village would prosper for another year. But they also knew that the time would come again, when the fields grew barren and the harvest man would rise once more, demanding another life to feed the earth. And so, the cycle continued, year after year, the harvest man standing watch over the fields, waiting patiently for the next harvest, and the next sacrifice.